Well, good afternoon. It's good to be here. And as he said, I am in Collinsville, Illinois, previously the location of the Issues Etc. conference. So maybe you'd been to my church if you'd been to one of the conferences before they were at River Forest. But that's where I'm located. So Pastor Ramirez talked to me about doing this speech, and I asked him, well, what do you want me to cover? What do you want me to do? And he said, I want you to talk about getting ready for what is to come. And he called it cultural doomsday preparation. Statements on what I think may be coming and how we should prepare for them. And so I asked him, so you want me to tell the future? And he said, yeah, kind of, if you can, if you would do that for us. And so at the beginning of this presentation, for the record, I will state my predictions of the future. After that, what I say is not a command of the Lord, but rather my own takes on what may be coming. So for the record, here are my predictions. Wars, rumors of wars, and earthquakes, I think is the third one that we usually get into. As for how I think it will go for us as a church body, I did copy off a page from a church history book for you. I'm not going to begin my presentation by reading you an entire page of church history. I find it to be a fascinating page of church history. I'll let you read it on your own later on. But what I wanted to point out, it is a page of church history from when the church was being persecuted and how the church responded in various places. So one of the things you'll see that he says, some people simply stopped doing public worship. Other people went on with public worship and suffered consequences. Other people would hand over their church books. Some refused to hand over their church books and were imprisoned for it. Others, when they had a sympathetic sheriff, could kind of put their Bible dust jacket over some medical tomes, hand it over to the sheriff, and he considered that fine. Everyone went about doing what they were doing before. And so this actually was during the Donatist controversy. And so as you know, when everyone's doing their own thing, everyone is pointing fingers at everyone else and telling them that they were doing it wrong. At the end of the page, he mentions a laywoman who got into it with a bishop because he rebuked her for ostentatiously kissing the relic of a martyr that was, quote, not recognized by the ecclesiastical authorities, unquote. And he just says this highlights how personal issues gum up the works of the church's operation. So as I said, he's talking there about the Donatist controversy. And when I read that page, it gave me a better understanding, a better appreciation of what's going on during the Donatist controversy. But secondly, it looked to me like exactly how life in synod works. And so for how we are going to go forward, I am betting that history will repeat itself in some fashion. So that's, for the record, my official predictions for the future. Everything else is simple speculation, my take on where we may be headed. Obviously, with telling the future, it could go 1,000 different directions. I'm sure you guys have your own ideas. I would love to chat about them later, and we can do so. Ramirez mentioned to me the idea of the slippery slope, and he and I think, both agree that it's not something that's in front of us any longer. Probably most people in the room recognize that we are headed down the slope, and we've slipped. So what are we going to do? When did this slip start? At least the one that we're currently on. And that's hard to pin down exactly. It depends on what you want to highlight. But I would say at least the one that we all recognize we're on is that there were warnings after and during the sexual revolution. There were more warnings when there was pornography and gay characters on TV and sitcoms and dramas and all those kind of places, and they were accepted and celebrated. And this has only continued to metastasize. The shows and books we see now openly anachronize that kind of stuff back into historical books and shows, kind of retconning history for the younger generations. And so it seems that history is more likely a waxen nose than the scriptures ever have been. And to continue with the metaphor of the slope, I'll just say Obergefell is where we lost our footing as a country officially and openly, because in that opinion, you have the Supreme Court basically saying that every single one of us has an autonomous right to define reality. And that is absurd. That's one heck of a slip. That is a fall. And instead of trying to scramble back up the slope, try and work our way backwards, no, we turn down the hill. We're running down the hill currently like one of those guys chasing the cheese wheel. And we will somersault and break bones as we go down. That is what is ahead of us as a culture. And so as we go into the future, as we look at the future, there are just three things that I wanted to note, but just in passing. There are issues that we've all had to deal with already. In some way, we will continue to deal with them. I really can't add too much to them other than to point them out. One is the trans issues, the LGBT issues. Obviously, it's going to be a problem continuing forward. I honestly hope that it can't go on as fast and as hard as it is currently. And I say that because, simply put, it is too damaging. You have people cutting parts of themselves off. And even as wrecked and as corrupt as our culture is, they are going to notice that after a while. In some mainstream way, the authorities that the culture looks at least part of the time, like doctors and psychologists and psychiatrists, I hope they will step in and slow things down. Obviously, they're not going to put a stop to it. That would be racist. But they can slow it down. And so I don't know if some of you may have seen that report on CBS where they talked to people who had wanted to transition and then wanted to untransition, or maybe you saw it on Tucker where he talked about the report on CBS. And what they were interviewing different people. Two different people said that when they walked into their doctor's office or the psychiatrist's office and talked about this issue, they weren't asked any questions about how their life was going. They weren't asked any questions about what was going on in their family life. They were asked none of the basic questions that anyone else who stepped into that kind of office would be asked. Instead, they both had hormone prescriptions within a month. One of them was operated on in less than 6 months. And I pray that that cannot go on that quickly much longer, that someone will step in. But as they say in regard to the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. So we will have to continue to prepare. As always with foolishness, it is the young and gullible who are most susceptible to this kind of thing. So we will have to continue to pound it into our confirmation students, our high school students, our college-age students. Secondly, issues with technology. As far as I can see, we've been having issues with technology for a while. This is not going to stop. It's too large and varied a subject for me to talk about much, but I do like something that Alan Jacobs pointed out when people were in a huff about the Harry Potter books being anti-Christian or something like that because they had magic in them. And Jacobs simply pointed out something along the lines of, listen guys, magic can clearly be a stand-in for technology. And churches aren't up in arms about science fiction works as they are with fantasy books, and I get it. I know why. But he says, listen, traveling somewhere very fast, having something within your own hand or powers within your own hand that can hurt people or even kill them instantly, talking to people or moving long distances, controlling things over long distances, is that magic or is that technology? He says, just for the worlds that those books are set in, those things are just taken for granted. What the characters in the books have to do then is they have to ask themselves, how am I going to interact with this technology, or how am I going to interact with this magic? Am I going to use it for good? Am I going to use it for ill? It's the exact question we have with technology. How are we going to interact with it? How are we going to use it? Some of it we will use without any problems. Some of it we will use for some things, not for others. Some we may try to get around altogether and refuse to use, but is not going away. And I would point out that the car actually changed civic and family life far more than computers ever have. And I don't think any of us who drove here today are about to go back on that kind of technology, right? We just have to figure out how we're going to use it. You might say, well, maybe the Amish had a point. Maybe they're not completely crazy when you see the kind of disruption that causes. Thirdly, in passing, this idea kind of floating around about there being a civil war in the modern US, I personally see no organized way for that to go forward. Sure, there may be an uprising somewhere, there may be talk of secession. I personally do not see how it goes beyond that. We are all too intermeshed, we live among each other far too much for that kind of thing, as far as I could see, to happen. And even places that you know talk tough on that, places like Texas that have some sort of secession talk. I mean, what are they going to do with Austin? What are they going to do with Dallas and Houston? Are they going to be Texas without those places? And furthermore, I would say that even if it went down, even if we have some kind of actual fracas that splits the country, I still don't see how it works out. And I mean, I don't see how it works out among people who say that they're on the same side. Say you want to kick all the liberals out, fine, poof, they're gone. But how are you going to arrange the government? How are you going to arrange public life? And we could ask ourselves, even in this room, we could ask that question. What would that look like? Chesterton had in his book, What's Wrong with the World, he was talking about how we often like to look out at the culture and the world around us, and we use oftentimes a medical metaphor. We look out at the world, we see things that are wrong, see things that are broken, and we want to try and fix the culture the way that doctors fix patients that come into their room. However, he says, quote, "The social case is exactly the opposite of the medical case. We do not disagree like doctors about the precise nature of the illness while agreeing about the nature of health. On the contrary, we all agree that England is unhealthy, but half of us would not look at her in what the other half would call blooming health." And then he continues, "The only way to discuss the social evil is to get at once to the social ideal. We can all see the national madness, but what is national sanity?" Unquote. So to put my recap on it, doctors have someone come into their office with a hurt arm or a pain in their guts. All the doctors know that there is something wrong, but more importantly, they know that something is wrong because they know what a healthy arm is and how proper guts function. And so they may all have different diagnoses about what is wrong. One may say, hey, all you need is a cast. Another may say, hey, we've got to operate on you. You've got to have surgery. Third may have some other diagnosis, say it's cancer. He wants to treat it with radiation. He wants to treat it with chemo. But they all know what they are aiming for. They're all aiming for a restored arm that can move and function as we know good arms do. This is not so with our cultural and civic life. We can all see, liberals, conservatives, however you want to label yourself, we all see things that are wrong, but we all disagree about what a rightly ordered world should look like. And I bet that is even true among us here in this room today. How would you reorganize things? And someone might say, hey, let's do democracy again, or a Republican form of government again. Let's get it right this time. Another person across the room will laugh and say, no, we need a monarchy. We need a king. Third person might say, what we need is libertarian anarchism, minarchism, something along those lines. But does any of us know what we're aiming for? Does anyone know what health looks like? Does it look like 1776 or 1788? Does it look pre-1776? Does it look like Constantine back in 300? Should it be a Christian government? I happen to think it should. I think that whatever you would put forward should sound something like Psalm 2. a text that maybe should have gotten a more play in our circles over the last few decades than it has. But what does it look like? I'm standing up here, I'm saying, I don't know. Furthermore, I don't think any of you know either, or at least any of us would agree on what you say. In Matthew 16, Jesus chides the Pharisees and the Sadducees for not recognizing the signs of the times that they're living in. And given what we've talked about already, gender, technology, government, and especially the confusion that we have over these things, some of which are pretty basic, some of which are pretty fundamental to our lives as men and women, I would put forward that we are in some phase of the Romans 1 thing of becoming futile in our thinking. God giving us over to our desires. And I say that because it's clear that confusion reigns. That is the sign that I am reading of our time. And so these things, especially the LGBT stuff, it brings to my mind the close of the commandments, that if the sons of the next generation do not repent of the sins of the fathers, then the consequences are going to get worse. And so we didn't repent of the sexual revolution. Next generation deals with gay stuff. We don't repent of the gay stuff. The next generation has people literally turning reproductive organs inside out. We refuse to see what God created man and woman differently for, and so maybe that line goes back further, even to the 1930s. And so we end up where we are now. Likewise, we've refused to see what government is for. Instead of serving the Lord with fear, kissing the Son lest he be angry, and maintaining justice through the land, at this point, it appears that everyone has agreed that one of the main purposes of government is to rig economic stats so that the numbers always look good, no matter what the situation is on the ground, no matter what we can see with our own eyes. GDP's up, must be doing fine. Stock market's up, we're all doing great, right? We've all agreed that the government is, at least one main point of the government is to make people financially better, even if it just means making up money and handing it out. We'll talk about that a bit more in a bit. So confusion reigns, and where confusion reigns in the culture around us, it is not going to stay outside of the church. And this is something I do want to dwell on for a second. Namely, that our government declared church to be not essential last year. And remember, that happened while Donald Trump was president. The rest of the GOP, as always, was completely useless. Here is the sadder reality, though. Many of the lay people in our churches agreed with that verdict. Sadder yet, many pastors, many district presidents, other higher-ups also agreed with this. That someone could hold up Romans 13 as a reason not to hold church is beyond me. I don't understand how you could quote the scriptures, much of which was written by people who at least served time in jail for preaching the gospel week in and week out, and as we all know, some gave their lives for it, to quote them as being in line with the idea that we have no king but Caesar, that we have to listen to him even when he tells us to stop going to church. To me, that is truly shameful. I do not know how it happened. I was shocked last year. And I don't think many of our churches have gotten around to pre-COVID-19 life yet. I don't know if they ever will. But one thing I will say is that I think the future of the church will be with those who actually physically go to church. And I think we as pastors need to do as much as we possibly can to ensure that physical church happens. You can stream the service as well, fine. I think we probably all do at this point. But the option for people to show up and hear and eat and drink, that needs to be available. So this is the only political advice that I will give during this presentation. We need to vote for people in district and synod offices who will fight for us to do that. Not to mention just your local civic offices and even the sheriff's office. It turns out when push comes to shove on these kind of things, those offices matter too. And if district and synod officials will not help us out on this front, if they will not support pastors who want to do that, I don't know, we're going to have to figure out some other kind of arrangement. This is going to involve them hiring lawyers to fight for us. The only reason the governor of Illinois eventually backed down was because he knew that the case was going to go before some of the Supreme Court justices. This is the only way it happened in other states as well. So we need men in these offices, as well as the board of directors or whoever else helps make those decisions, who will do that kind of thing on our behalf and to speak out so that we can take those statements to our council meetings, that we can take those statements to our elders meetings and voters meetings so that people don't think that their pastor is crazy and a loner because he wants to keep church doors open in times of disaster, in times of crisis. And if meeting together officially in a building becomes impossible, and insurance companies may have their say in this, then we need to start thinking about how we're going to do it elsewhere, how we're going to do it off the grid, how we're going to do it behind enemy lines. Because we have an enemy, you all know this, we have an enemy. Satan is our opponent, and Christ makes it clear in the scriptures that Satan is not divided. He's rather organized. The demons aren't countermanding each other. They are in it for the long haul. They're willing to play this game down through generations. We are seeing it play out down through generations right now. And everyone in this room recognizes, I hope, that at the core of America's problems is the spiritual problem of idolatry, of not fearing, loving, and trusting God above all things. Satan getting church declared not essential, I say that's a pretty big win for him. And we need to be thinking about this. Ideally, I hope that that kind of stuff would be talked about at the synod level and at the district level, but if not, it needs to come down to this level. We as pastors need to talk about it. And I just point out, again, obviously I just copied off a page of history. This is not something new. This kind of thing has happened before. The church fathers and their congregations dealt with this kind of stuff. The New Testament talks about this kind of thing. We need to talk amongst ourselves, and I would add, with our parishioners about this. One of the books that has broached this subject, getting enough attention that I even had lay people asking me about it, is Dreyer's Benedict option. And guys, I know Dreyer has his flaws. They all irritate me just as much. But credit where due, Dreyer was discussing a good question. How should the church prepare for this? And as far as I could tell, the LCMS was founded to do exactly what Dreyer was talking about. It was founded as a community gathered around churches and schools to keep us Christian, to keep the next generations Christian, insofar as we are able. Now, Dreyer's more recent thing about hard versus soft totalitarianism, hey, he makes some good points. He thinks it will be soft. He thinks it will be the carrot, not the stick. That may be true, although I wonder what Christians in Canada are thinking about that right now. But we have seen the move in action here already. It's going to be some combination of legal bullying and corporate bullying. This is something obviously that happened last year legally. Our lay people have been going through it in the corporate world. I'm sure you've heard tales from your people about different kind of tolerance trainings and whatnot. We need to help our people prepare for that. Help them think about their livelihoods, and I think we will need to think about our own livelihoods as well. I think the pressure could easily go up rather than down in the future. And so, you can even think of things like on social media. Do your people mention or remark that they're members of your congregation? Or is that known generally? Could some HR flack then take that information, go to your website, and listen to a couple of your sermons and find out what you think about the current cultural topics? Could that member be fired? Could they lose promotions because of that kind of thing? I think that's a very real scenario. Douglas Wilson was talking about this a while back, and I think he's correct on this. He says that we have to have in our mind, and our people have to have in their minds, some lines that they just refuse to cross. People have to internally, mentally, be prepared at some point to say, no, I'm not going to do that, and then let the chips fall. As always, that kind of thing is going to be easier said than done. I am sure we will lose people from the pews when it's decision time on that kind of thing. But as pastors, we need to talk to them about this. Remember, the Israelites were relatively well fed as slaves, something that they remind Moses of repeatedly. In the Matrix, the gruel tastes like steak, and people are totally fine with that. But we are to call them out of that slavery. We need to call them to the Sabbath rest and the feast that is found only in Jesus Christ. And that means calling them to church. It's going to be a lifelong fight for them as it will for us. But there needs to be places to talk about God, and I think that's got to begin with church. We need to fight for the church. And by that I mean we simply have to fight at this point for having church. Not just a podcast or stream, as advantageous as those things may be, but the gathering of the believers around Jesus Christ, physically around word and sacrament. And I would say that if you won't fight for the church, someone else will, but you will have been found faithless. We all know that the church will go on. Jesus promises this. It's amusing to me that when we talk with delinquents in our parish or when we talk about them, we all love to quote Hebrews 10, the verse about not neglecting the gathering. And there, he is talking to people who are under pressure. He is telling them not to neglect the gathering because that is what people were tempted to do because of what was going on around them in their culture. He wasn't talking about soccer teams scheduling practice or games on Sunday morning. People already have a sinful tendency to let church slide. They have a million reasons for it. But what about if it's actually going to be hard? What about if there's going to be persecution or pressure? How much more then will they be likely to have the thought, well, I'll just believe on my own. I'll just be a Christian in my own home. That's easy, right? Still a Christian, right? Well, the author to the Hebrews said, don't do that. Don't neglect the gathering. Don't give in to government and corporate and cultural bullying. And Dreyer failed here. When he writes a book on the church surviving communism, telling us that this is the kind of thing we should be preparing for, and then he turns around and says that we should close our doors because of a disease, I mean, he's wrong. It makes no sense to me to close for something that is non-discriminating, like a virus, but then turn around and tell people that they have to be ready to face a government or a culture that will specifically be looking for Christians to persecute and arrest and punish. We can just ask, even though we've all probably done wrong over the last year and a half, we can ask ourselves, do you think that Christians fared better in communism or during COVID-19? Right? There's no comparison there. So where do we go from here? And the answer I have, obviously, is not going to be new or flashy. It's not a silver bullet. It's going to be the same answer that the previous generations have had. I was reading through the Psalms, and in Psalm 12, this is the psalm where David talks about the faithful disappearing. He talks about being flattered to his face, talked down elsewhere. It ends with this verse: the wicked prowl on every side when vileness is exalted among the sons of men. And that's not a verse that's out of place now, one might think. And in Kidner's commentary, he points out that, I mean, it's just a beautiful comment. He points out that despite all of these verses that David has and how he is talking about this, David is not backing down. David is not retreating in the psalm. In the psalm, which is a prayer, he is calling for backup. He is asking God for help in this. In other words, David is fighting. And reading and hearing that kind of thing, right? David is a hero, just as Daniel or Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are heroes. I hope that you want to be like them. There is something attractive to guys, to men, about that kind of thing. Even non-Christians like Jordan Peterson have picked up on this over the last decade. The idea is that boys like adventure. They like a fight. There is something to seeing our lives in this way. Paul uses competition terms. He uses soldiering terms over and over again. I think it would benefit us to look at the future this way, as if you were on an adventure, as if you were in a battle. You have no idea how it's going to turn out for you personally, but you want to go down fighting. And if actual persecution does come in the States, I assume attendance will drop. That would mean risks for us that mirror the risks that we talked about earlier for our lay people. Some or many of us may at some point not be able to support ourselves only by the gospel, and we will have to seek other employment. You need to be ready for that. You need to start thinking about that. And furthermore, I would say that the thinking has to go beyond simply, I'll just get a job for FedEx. I'll just deliver Prime packages every day. That's fine. That may be what some of us have to do. But there is a temptation here. There is a danger when shepherding becomes a side gig, when it becomes a hobby. This is part of the problem with the way that the SMP program is often used these days, because it has the possibility of decreasing the office, both to us and to the people we serve. If it's a hobby for us, then as we all know with volunteers, they all tend to do the stuff that they like to do, and they can leave the rest for someone else. We might tend more and more to avoid tackling the hard stuff. Dilettantes are in it for the fun to be had, not for the heavy lifting. And we don't want dilettantes in the pulpit. That's not healthy for us. That's not healthy for the church. It needs to be serious work, even if it's part-time work, or even if it's something that we do with another job. It also may have the effect of losing the distinction of the office in front of others. If you are just another working stiff among other working stiffs, then what's so special about you? What's so special about being a pastor? Now, I think those kind of things can be handled. We will just have to face them when it comes. There are faithful pastors now and through the centuries who have worked elsewhere. We just need to prepare for it. And while we're on the topic of work, I wanted to bring up another trouble that I think could be coming in the near term, namely with the government handing out all of this money and toying with something like universal basic income. There's definitely danger there. And it's a danger that I think will be faced more by those who are teenagers or younger currently. I think Gen X at this point is past that largely because we're over the hill. We all have jobs. We've lived this far in the world and our lives without it. We know that life can go on and will work without it. But what if your children are offered basic income? What if high schoolers are offered free tuition, free health care? Now, of course, there will be things that they cannot say out loud. They will have to agree that damaging lifestyles aren't actually damaging. Rather, they need to be celebrated. But if you can look the other way on that kind of stuff, then hey, kid, welcome to college. You don't have to worry about those bills. You don't have to worry about doctor bills. You don't have to worry about dental bills. You can have housing and food free too while we're at it. And join with all of the other people your age who are doing it and getting along more or less happily. So yeah, I think that could be a huge temptation going forward. And I would also point out that this attack, like many attacks, goes all the way back to the garden, goes all the way back to Genesis. In Genesis, we see that man is unique. We point this out to confirmands every year. Man is obviously unique in that we have been created in the image of God, But as you read through Genesis 1 and 2, man is also unique in that he is given work to do. God gives Adam a task to do, and that's different from all of the other animals. Life in the garden is not simply lying around and eating fruit. Adam is called to tend the garden and keep it. He is called to dominion, which is a reflection of our Lord's dominion through service. And so this idea of simply printing money and handing it out, this attacks us at the core of who we are and what we are to do in this life. Mark Stein, and it was a while back, but Mark Stein had this line along the line of, the real waste of indiscriminate welfare is not the waste of money, it's the waste of people. And that's exactly right. It ruins families. It has become generational for some people at this point. And you might think that it couldn't get that bad, but if you talk to business owners in your congregation now who currently cannot hire people because of extended unemployment benefits, you will see it is already going on. And sure, they might not get paid as much sitting on the couch, but so what? They're sitting on the couch. They're watching Netflix. And it drives at the core that it's a statement that at the core, we are truly simply consumers, and that this is what makes for the best life. We all know that that is not going to pan out, but obviously this is a setup for some kind of subscription life. Sure, the government will give you income, education, healthcare. You will have to sign their statement of faith, or your subscription gets pulled. And how easy is that going to be if you're about to get out of high school? We need to teach this to our confirmands. We need to teach it to our high schoolers. It was not good for man to be alone. This is true. It was also not good for him to be idle. And the non-flashy, but I would emphasize, ever triumphant answer to all of this, our center always has to be the word of the Lord. And I know that's not new. I'm simply restating the truth. And I didn't want to go out on a pessimistic note, so I wanted to remind us all of fights that the church has won just over the past 50 years to give us some kind of perspective. And the first one that I wanted to point out was higher criticism. We won that fight. Now, obviously, it still kinds of exists, but not really. The original higher critics found careers by battling against rubes and a culture who believed the Bible as it was written. But those guys don't have kids that care about that fight. And so now we are living in a golden age of Christian commentaries coming out. The escape that literary criticism gave our guys turned into a garden of faithful people thinking about the Bible as books and as stories, and thinking about it in that way and finding out the different interconnectedness between them and what those kind of things mean. There's tons of good stuff out there right now. And we won that fight because of our forefathers. And here I actually mean literal fathers and uncles and grandfathers who held to the word despite the pressure of the culture around them. They refused to go along with it. They chose to fight. Number two, a spin-off maybe of this, the more recent antinomian discussion over the last couple decades. I hope that we have turned a corner on this. We have profs at both SEMs fighting against this openly. And again, it happened simply by reading the entire Bible, refusing to capitulate, but instead fight. You just have to state the words of the Lord. You just have to state the words of Paul and the prophets over and over and over again. Number three, maybe the largest, and maybe this is premature, but I don't think so, evolution. When I was in college, I could see no way around that wall. There is no way that that is going to fall. And it's only been 2 decades since I've been out of college, but with 2 more decades of actual science being done, I now think that in my lifetime, evolution as we currently know it will be all but untenable as a scientific position. The numbers don't add up. People are starting to notice evolutionists, if you listen to them or if you read their stuff, they're clearly grasping at straws at this point. I don't think that it will go away. It will always stand as the atheistic option for people who don't want to hold to some kind of religion. But the new atheists may have been the last big push. And already the new atheists are at least a decade, maybe 15 years ago. This has been a fight that went on not just for decades, that fight went on for centuries. But the church faithfully held to the scriptures. The church fought, and lo and behold, it came out the other side. I will add, I think there is a twist to this one, though. We may get the W on that, but increasingly, the response that I'm getting and the response that I'm seeing over and over other places is increasingly, so what? I don't care. And this is a change, I think, and the major challenge facing us as we go forward, namely apathy. When I was younger, and I don't think it was just because I was younger, and I don't think it was just a phase that I was going through, but when I was younger, creation and evolution debates, those were a thing. Both sides were interested in the debate. Both sides were interested in putting up rational arguments for their side, and this was because people cared. This is not the case anymore. These days, you find people simply don't care. They might offer up a half-hearted excuse for why they believe in evolution or a defense for evolution. But if you come back and you restate the numbers or you restate their case, usually the response is something along the lines of, whatever. It's not simply a don't know, it's a don't care. As one of my coworkers said, it's an apathetic nihilism. It lacks a conviction of anything. And this kind of apathy, I think, will be the next big struggle for us. Because if someone doesn't actually care, then the solution is not going to be evidence. The solution is not going to be a reasoned argument or anything like that, because they don't care. And the confusion brought about by the media feeds this. Peterson just wrote about this recently, right? The media is designed to produce this effect. No one knows who to believe. No one knows what to believe. Everyone has an expert on their side. Satan has used this well to make people cynical and to make people indifferent on all sorts of topics. And like I said earlier, if that kind of thing is in the culture, it will not stay outside of the church. We already face apathy on things like church attendance, for example. We already face apathy on LGBT issues. We already face apathy on marriage or premarital issues. We already face apathy on abortion issues. Lay people or even clergy members, they just don't want to talk about that. They do not want to deal with that kind of stuff. They don't care, especially if it involves conflict. They say, we'll just talk about other things. But again, this is a fight that will be won by the church. And it will be won by those who cling to the word, who confess the truth even when people don't care, even in the face of conflict. This is something we should learn from the Old Testament prophets when God tells them at the beginning of their career that no one is going to listen to them. We need to be mentally prepared for that. A couple years ago, when it was all the rage, we had a cop come in and speak at our church to the pastors and the elders and the ushers about an armed intruder coming into the church. And he didn't start by talking to us about physical maneuvers that we might do. He didn't talk about takedown techniques. He didn't even talk about how you're going to have armed men at certain points throughout the sanctuary. No, he said, before you get to any of that, the key to this is that you have to be prepared mentally. None of that other stuff matters if you aren't prepared beforehand mentally. And the mental preparation he was talking about was that You have to be willing to confront someone who is unknown, especially if they look shady, especially if they look like a suspicious character when they come in the door. If you don't know them, just go up and introduce yourself to them. Speak with them. Talk with them. And he says, if you do that, and if when you do that, they seem off in some way, they're profusely sweating, they're wearing a long jacket in the middle of the summer, and he says, you watch them continually, and you do so unapologetically. And then if it comes down to it, you have to be willing to throw yourself at a dangerous person. Kick them, tackle them, hit them, throw stuff at them, whatever it is. But you have to be determined that they are not going to harm anyone unless it is through you. And as this guy is doing this, I mean, he's perfect, 110% cop. When you have a picture of a cop, he is that guy. And when he's talking about this, he is laying out the motions. And it was quite the image before, like I said, pastors and elders and ushers, and my elders and ushers, I'm sure look like your elders and ushers. They're stand-up guys, they're good men, but they don't look like bouncers. They don't all look like soldiers. And here he is talking about things like tackling a guy, getting him in a headlock and biting his ear, raking their face, trying to gouge out their eyes. And he was right. If you're not even willing to think that kind of thought, then you're going to be unprepared. And whatever happens when that type of thing goes down, it's going to be complete chance because you won't be doing anything. And so as we go forward, we need to prepare ourselves. We need to prepare ourselves mentally. We need to prepare ourselves for having church in the flesh, for teaching our children and neighbors about right and wrong. We need to be just like preparing like as if a physical confrontation is coming. We can't expect it to be like a video game or a movie where we just watch or minimally participate and expect, well, everything will turn out all right. We just expect the win and the trophy to get handed over to us without any real fight. No, you and I are called to faith in our time, right now. And we can look at this as an adventure knowing that it will be victorious for the church, even if we take some casualties. We have what we need. We have the Word of God. We have the resurrected Lord on our side. And furthermore, I think the LCMS especially is blessed to have tools that we need to fight for this. We have churches. We have families with mothers and fathers and children. We still have some schools. Don't give them up. If they need fixing, fight to fix them. We should fight for them, and we should fight with them. And by that, I don't mean against them. I mean that those are the places that we wield the sword of God that is the Scriptures to reprove, rebuke, exhort, encourage people to live the lives that they have been called to live in Jesus Christ. The opposite of that kind of mental preparation is the apathy that I mentioned earlier. That kind of apathy is a form of hardness of heart. We need to care. God has given us things in our lives to care about. We should do it zealously, which I think is what Pastor Broughton's going to talk about on Wednesday. So, there we go.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Scott. I know you gave us a lot to think about, and that was one of the points, I believe, that you wanted people to continue to discuss and consider these things.
You talked about getting after the catechumens young people. How about the old people that are already apathetic?
Yeah, so his question was, I talked about talking to the catechism to young people. How about talking to the old people? Yeah, I assume you're doing this, and you should be doing it in some fashion from the pulpit. You should be doing it in Bible class, right? You can't be hiding this stuff from your lay people, or else they will think you're crazy and a loner when you eventually just snap and say, no, I'm not doing this. You should be prepping them. You should be talking about the Bible. You should be talking about church history insofar as, hey, the church has gone through this before. And I mean, most of the old people now have been through a lot of the higher critical fight. They know that the key is to cling to the scriptures. They know that the key is to trust the Lord, and he will bring them through this. So the question was about apathy in regard to LGBT stuff, and I mean, I also mentioned evolution type stuff. I mean, I don't know that there's, I honestly think this is going to be a struggle because, like I said, if they don't actually care about something, then it's not just going to be a reason to argument or you telling them, well, here's evidence for the other side.
Well, I need something else, actually.
Okay.
That they're not just apathetic, but they're thinking, well, why should we oppose it? Because it's something people want, and who am I to get in his way? It's a form of apathy.
Yeah, so it's a form of apathy that's just going to let other people live and let live. Well, I mean, there's just the point of, yeah, that's true. I'm not going to force my neighbor not to be gay. I mean, we all recognize that kind of thing. But this is what I mean. When we're talking in the pulpits, we need to be able to go back to Genesis and say, in the beginning it was not so, right? Man and woman were created differently. They were created differently for reasons of God's design. They were created for our benefits, for our safety, and that we shouldn't be shy about saying this. Not that I'm saying you are, but I mean, we as a whole can't be shy about saying that. And yeah, it's going to be unpopular. You know this I mean, there are all sorts of issues that are unpopular. We just have to slog through it. I wish I knew something better.
Kind of picking up on both the free monies and the fighting for things. It seems to me that there are two different ways that we can approach things. One is by fighting for things. I guess one aspect of the question is, beyond our churches and schools, are there other entities or organizations of the church that we should be fighting for? Here I'm thinking specifically about the four-year university system. And then on top of that, it strikes me that along with fighting for things, what we need to see is the time to build. And you know, Mark's going to talk about the classical college, but time to build things, and I'm wondering, like, I don't know how many kids you have, but like me, you probably got a check from the government. Well, you know, you can become apathetic about it, but we can also look at this as, let's use this opportunity to build and to do something, to make something of it. So if our kids get a universal basic income, I think could either walk away from that, or we can teach them how to actually use that to build more for what they have.
Yeah, so the statement here is about fighting for things, yes, but also a time to build. I think you're perfectly in line there. With the Concordia University system especially, I mean, we have to be realistic. Do we need all 7 of them? Are they actually doing what they were designed to do? Maybe that's the most basic question about them. But yeah, I want there to be Concordia universities for us to send children to. And I do think you're right. I think what the Preußes are doing out in Wyoming, that's fantastic. I think we should be thinking about doing more of that. I think this is maybe something that, I don't know how many of you read the Benedict option, but he does talk about building and starting schools there. I think he's probably a little bit naive in thinking, I mean, there's obviously a lot of excitement when you want to get something started, and there's volunteer, and there's money laid out at the beginning. It's when you get 10 years, 20 years down the road that it becomes much harder, because then maintenance bills, like putting a $250,000 roof on a school, becomes a real issue. And actually, you've worked beyond what your volunteers will do, and so now you need to pay someone, and pay them something that's at this point going to be more than $15 an hour, or whatever we're now going to have minimum wage be. I think this is one of the reasons that we need to fight for those kind of places, because they all have some of that built in. And if we can steer them to the purposes that they were originally intended for, great. But I think it's naive if you go in saying, hey, I'm going to build, this is going to be great, and then you find 5, 8, 10 years later that it just has a lot of bills. And any real school does. And that's just hard. If you're going to maintain a school for decades, you're going to have to put real money into it. And it goes beyond just people working part-time and volunteerism. Those things are all great, but yeah, it's going to take money, dedication, time, all. But I'm all for building, but I'm for building smartly and with an eye to keeping costs reasonable and that kind of thing. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I think one of the things that we just haven't talked enough about is that it's going to require sacrifice.
What's that?
I mean, you can't have a school and have the pastor making six figures. You know, the pastor has to give something up, the teachers have to give something up, those parents have to give something up, right? And what, it's not just true for the school, that's true for the congregation, it's true for our lives together. And I think in many ways we've just been so corrupted by, you know, the kind of American dream of success and the free money all. I mean, it's just time to tell people the truth.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, you're absolutely correct. It's going to take sacrifice. There is a line, though, between sacrifice and taking advantage of, which is the flip side of this that other schools and churches have been writing for a long time, where already, even at district scale, our teachers are going to make less than they do in the public school system. And they all agree with this, and there are benefits to being obviously in a private school rather than a public school. But there are many churches who are at 85, 80, 70% scale. Look at the scale of your district. How could you honestly tell a young man to be a Lutheran church school teacher and say, you know what, you're only going to make $25,000 a year or $30,000? I mean, you can go up as high as you want, but I guarantee they're not starting out at 60, which is what all of your other laymen in the corporate world expect of their job. And so there is just a line, and this is why I'm talking about maintaining that and treating people fairly has to be an open discussion. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It will involve sacrifice, but at the same time, I don't think that you want to say to your young people, well, none of you want to be Lutheran teachers because none of you could afford having a family that way.
Well, I think it's like you say to them, how many of you want to be Marines? I think we got to raise the bar. So we don't say, look, some of you can't be Marines. You're not tough enough. You're not willing to do it. You don't want to suffer. And, you know...
How long are people Marines, though?
Well, okay, but there's got to be... And I'm not just talking about school. I mean, the church life in times of more difficult persecution and hostility is going to require that we stop being so soft and that we stop measuring ourselves according to the success of the corporate world. And I think that we can actually raise up some people, and some people are willing to do it. You know, so let's you know, so you're calling it apathy. I think it's sloth.
Yeah.
And the opposite of sloth is hope, right? So, I mean, there is a certain sense in which, yeah, you'll work for $20,000 because the work itself is worth it. And there are some boys that are willing to do it.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's some boys that are willing to do it. There are also probably ways that we should rethink school. And do we have to compare and compete with the elementary school? Now that, on the other side, is a hard sell to actual parents. But
that's where the really harder battle is for parents.
Back to the issue of the authority and inerrancy of Scripture. You said how we won that battle. And thanks be to God, guess who did? You said older lay people realize that. I think you'd be surprised how many of them do not. I was first year at St. Louis in 73, 74. I was there for the walkout. I was one of the few who did not walk. That's a long story. But this past spring, I was invited to a district, to the Rocky Mountain District, to a thing, I forget what they call it, but it's old codgers Lutherans, you know. And there's a bunch of lay people who want to do the big thing before the end of life here. And so these are very engaged LCMS people. There are about 100 of them at this event. And they asked me to speak on that whole thing. They had no idea. So many of them came up to me and said, you know, I heard about that, but I didn't know what was going on. They
met with some younger pastors a while back who, using LCMS parlance, or self-identified confessional Lutherans, okay. And I said something about this whole thing. They laughed it off. That was nothing. Oh, that was nothing. And there was one other older pastor, and I said, brothers, you have no idea. We almost lost it all. So my encouragement is, those of you who didn't live through it, let the one who thinks he stands firm take heed lest he fall. We need to tell our people, devil, flesh, and world are still battling against the Bible. And if we say, oh, we won that 50 years ago, be careful.
Yeah.
You want to say that back, Scott?
Yeah. Let not him who puts on his armor boast in sin face off.
They think of it.
This is the last